The cuffs snapped shut so hard they bit into the skin, and the big man in the uniform smiled a slow, satisfied smile. He shoved the biker face first against the gas pump and kicked his heavy boots apart. A crowd was already forming, phones up, and nobody moved to help. The cop leaned in close and said something ugly, something about where people like him belonged in this country. The biker did not fight back. He just stood there, cheek pressed against cold metal, and he said 6 quiet words. "You should not have done that." His name was Daniel Cross, and 40 years of hard history sat folded inside that calm. Why would one arrest at a nowhere gas station, bring 2,000 bikers down on this town before the coffee even got cold? Nobody watching had the first idea what was coming. Stay with me on this one. Let me back up and tell you how a quiet Tuesday afternoon turned into the loudest day that town had ever seen. Because to understand what happened at that gas station, you have to understand the man in the cuffs, and you have to understand the man who put them there. Two men. Same asphalt. Two completely different lives. And believe me, only one of them knew how deep the water really was. Daniel Cross was 66 years old. He rode an old black touring bike that he had rebuilt with his own hands more times than he could count. He was a big man, shoulders like a door frame, hands scarred from 30 years of engine work and one very long war before that. His beard had gone silver a long time ago. His eyes were the kind of calm that scares people who know what they are looking at, and means nothing to people who do not. Daniel was black. He had grown up poor in a mill town that does not exist anymore, and he had spent 2 tours in a jungle a long way from home before he ever put a leg over a motorcycle. He came back from that war with a limp that faded and a quiet that never did. He did not talk much. That is the first thing you would notice about him. He listened. He watched. And when he did speak, people leaned in because Daniel Cross did not waste words. He had worn the same patch on his back for the better part of 40 years. Not because he was looking for trouble. Because a long time ago, when he had nothing and nobody, a group of men on motorcycles took one look at a lonely, angry veteran and decided he was one of theirs. They fed him. They gave him work. They stood between him and a world that had already decided what a man like him was worth. He never forgot that. Not for one single day. Let me tell you one small story about Daniel, because it explains everything that came later, and I do not want you to think the men who rode for him did it out of fear. When Daniel came home from the war, he could not sleep. He could not hold a job. He would sit up at 3 in the morning with the lights off and the door locked, listening for sounds that were 10,000 miles away and 20 years gone. His own family did not know what to do with the man who came back in the body of the boy they sent. He drifted. He drank more than he should have. He got smaller and smaller, the way a man does when the whole world keeps telling him he does not count. And one cold night, broke and half frozen at a roadside diner with no way home and no home to go to, a man he had never met sat down across from him, looked at the faded tattoo on his forearm, the unit and the year, and said only, "You were over there too." That man bought him a meal. Then he bought him a week of meals. Then he handed him a wrench and a place to sleep in the back of a shop and said, "You work, you eat, you got people now." That man's name was Roy, and Roy had no idea he was saving a life. He thought he was just feeding a hungry vet. But that is how it works. Nobody ever knows, in the moment, which small kindness is the one that keeps a man on this side of the ground. Daniel knew. Daniel spent the next 40 years knowing. Now here is the thing about that patch. Most people saw it and thought they knew the whole story. They saw leather and chrome and a rough-looking crew, and they filled in the rest with whatever they had seen on television. But the men who wore it, they knew a different truth. That patch was a promise. It said, if you come for one of us, you come for all of us. It said, we do not leave our people on the ground. Daniel had spent decades living that promise, mostly in quiet ways nobody ever saw. Hospital visits, funerals, sitting up all night with a brother going through the worst of it. He paid for kids' braces when their fathers could not. He drove 9 hours to sit in a courtroom, so a young man would see one friendly face. He was not a violent man by nature. But he belonged to something, and that something did not bend. Remember that. It matters later. On that particular Tuesday, Daniel was riding home from a memorial 2 states over. The man they buried was named Roy. Yes, that Roy. The same man who had sat down across from a broken young veteran in a roadside diner 40 years before and decided, without knowing it, to save him. Roy had finally lost a long fight with his lungs, the war catching up with him the slow way it catches up with a lot of them, and Daniel had driven through the night to be there. He had helped carry the casket. He had stood at the front of a room full of hard, weeping men and said the words, because everyone agreed there was no one else who could. He talked about the diner. He talked about the wrench. He talked about what it means to feed a man who has forgotten he is worth feeding. And then he had climbed back on his old black touring bike, alone, and started the long ride home, letting the road do what the road does for men like him. He was tired. He was grieving. He wanted a tank of gas, a cup of coffee, and about 400 more miles of empty highway. That was the whole plan. That was all he wanted from that town, and that town did not even have a name he would have remembered by dinner. The town was called Halstead Junction. Maybe 9,000 people, most of them decent, most of them just trying to get through the week like anybody. It had a water tower, a high school with a losing football team, 3 churches, a diner called the Bluebird that had been open since Eisenhower, and a police department with 11 officers. And it had a man named Officer Brett Kessler, who is the other half of this story, and the reason any of it happened at all. Kessler was 31. He was big too, Jim big, the kind of big that comes with a lot of looking in the mirror. He had wanted to be a cop his whole life, and for the wrong reasons. Not to help people. Not to keep the peace. He wanted the badge because the badge meant that, for the first time in his life, people had to do what he said. He had grown up the smallest kind of small, a boy nobody picked, a boy who got pushed around and swore that one day he would be the one doing the pushing. That is a sad thing when it happens to a child. It is a dangerous thing when that child grows up, and you hand him a gun and a badge and a town with nobody watching. He had been passed over for a bigger department in the city twice. He told himself it was politics. It was not politics. It was that the people who interviewed him could see something in his eyes that made them nervous, and they were right to be nervous. In Halstead Junction, Kessler was a big fish in a puddle. He wrote more tickets than any two other officers combined. He had a habit of pulling over cars that did not belong, and everybody in that town understood what did not belong meant. There had been complaints. There had been 3 of them, filed by 3 different people, and all 3 had quietly disappeared into a drawer because the chief was 2 years from his pension and did not want the headache. And here is where I want to introduce you to the man who is going to matter more than you would guess, so keep him in your mind. There was a sergeant on that department named Ruiz. Marcus Ruiz. 20 years on the job. A quiet, careful man who had come up the hard way and had seen every kind of cop there is. Ruiz had watched Kessler from the day he came on, and Ruiz did not like what he saw. He had tried more than once to do something about it. He had gone to the chief on his own time and laid it out plain. He had said, "That young man is going to hurt somebody, and when he does, it is going to land on all of us." And the chief, 2 years from a pension he had bled for, had looked at Ruiz and said, "Marcus, you got 2 years less on this planet than me. Let it lie. He writes good numbers. Council likes the numbers. Let it lie." So Ruiz let it lie. And he hated himself a little for it, the way a decent man hates himself when he swallows a truth to keep the peace. Remember Ruiz. His day is coming. So Kessler had learned the most dangerous lesson a bad man can learn. He had learned that there were no consequences. Not for him. Not there. And a man who believes there are no consequences will eventually meet the one situation where there are nothing but consequences. Daniel Cross was about to be that situation. The gas station sat on the edge of town, where the state road came in. A Sunoco, 4 pumps, a little store that sold jerky and lottery tickets and coffee that had been on the burner since morning. It was 2 in the afternoon. Slow. A couple of cars, a farm truck, a woman filling up a minivan with 2 kids fighting in the back seat. Ordinary. The most ordinary place in the world. That woman has a name, too, and I want you to know it because she is part of this. Sarah Combs. 34, a nurse's aide at the county hospital, 2 boys in the back seat, 7 and 10, on their way home from a dentist that had run late. Sarah had grown up in Halstead Junction. She knew exactly what kind of cop Kessler was, because everybody in that town knew, the way you know which dog on the block bites. She had a cousin who had been pulled over by Kessler 4 times in 1 year for nothing at all. So when Sarah Combs looked up from her gas pump and saw Kessler's cruiser roll in slow behind an old black man on a motorcycle, some instinct in her went cold, and without quite knowing why, she reached for her phone. Hold on to that. Her hands were going to be steadier than she thought. Daniel pulled in, killed the engine, and swung his leg off the bike with the slow care of a man whose knees have earned the right to be slow. He pulled off his gloves. He stretched his back. He walked inside, nodded at the kid behind the counter, and bought a large black coffee and a bottle of water. He was polite. He was quiet. He said thank you. The kid behind the counter, whose name was Tyler and who was 19 and bored out of his mind, would later tell everyone who asked that the biker had been the nicest customer he had all day. Called him sir. Asked him how his shift was going, and actually waited for the answer. And then Daniel walked back out to the pumps to fill his tank, and Officer Brett Kessler's cruiser rolled into the lot. Now Kessler had not been called there. There was no complaint, no dispatch, no report of anything wrong. He was on patrol, bored, cruising, and he saw a black man on a motorcycle with an outlaw patch on his back, and something in his small, mean brain lit up like Christmas. He saw a problem that did not exist. He saw a chance to be the big man in front of an audience. He pulled in slow, the way they do when they want you to see them coming, and he sat there for a second watching Daniel pump gas before he opened his door. "Long way from home, aren't you?" Kessler said. "Not a question." He hooked his thumbs in his belt and walked over with that rolling swagger that men use when they want everyone to understand who is in charge. Daniel looked up, then went back to watching the numbers climb on the pump. "Just passing through, officer," he said. His voice was low and even. "Get my gas and be gone." "I'll decide when you're gone," Kessler said. And there it was. That fast. He wanted Daniel to know that the rules of the normal world did not apply here, that here, on this asphalt, Kessler was the whole government and the whole law and the last word on everything. He started circling the bike. He looked at the plates. He looked at the patch and his lip curled. "That club," he said. "We don't want that garbage in my town." He said the word garbage, and he was not looking at the motorcycle when he said it. Daniel did not answer. He had been in rooms with men 100 times more dangerous than Brett Kessler, and he had learned a long time ago that you do not feed a small fire. He had learned it in a jungle, and he had learned it in bars, and he had learned it in the long, slow school of being a black man in America who wanted to get home in one piece. You keep your hands open. You keep your voice low. You give the small man nothing to grab. He topped off his tank, hung up the nozzle, and reached for his wallet to go pay. That was his mistake, if you can even call it that. Because Kessler's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. "Did I say you could move?" Kessler said. And now his voice was up, loud enough to carry, because the audience was the whole point. The woman with the minivan had stopped pumping. Tyler, the kid from the counter, was in the doorway. A couple of the farm truck men had turned to watch. And rolling in off the state road right then, easing up to the far pump for a soda and a stretch, was a long-haul driver named Earl Pruitt, 60 years old, 30 of them behind the wheel, who took one look at the scene and felt his stomach drop, because Earl had seen this movie before and he knew how it usually ended. Kessler could feel the eyes on him, and it fed something rotten in him. "Keep your hands where I can see them. You people always think you can just do whatever you want. You people." He said it out loud, in the middle of the afternoon, in front of a dozen witnesses, to a 66-year-old veteran who had bled for a country that had never once made it easy for him. And Daniel Cross, God bless him, still tried to keep the peace. "Officer," he said quietly, "I'm just paying for my gas. I don't want any trouble with you." He held very still. He kept his hands open. He did everything right. Understand that. He did everything a man is supposed to do, and it did not matter one bit, because Kessler had already decided how this was going to go. Kessler told him to put his hands on the bike. Daniel did. Kessler told him to spread his legs. Daniel did. And Kessler patted him down rough, rougher than he needed to, narrating the whole time about probable cause and matching a description, and how gang members like this were exactly the kind of trash the town was trying to keep out. There was no description. There was no probable cause. There was just a man with a badge and a grudge and an audience, and a quiet old veteran who had made the terrible mistake of stopping for gas in the wrong town. And that is where I want to leave the two of them for just a moment. Because in the next few minutes, everything you think you know about who had the power in that parking lot is going to turn completely upside down. But before it does, I need you to sit with the picture. An old man, hands on his motorcycle, doing everything right. A young cop, drunk on his own badge, doing everything wrong. And a dozen people watching, none of them knowing that the quiet man in the middle of it all was about to become the most important phone call any of them ever witnessed. For a few minutes, though, nothing else happened. That is the strange part. After the pat-down, Kessler ran Daniel's license, and it came back clean. Spotless. Not so much as a parking ticket in 30 years. Kessler sat in his cruiser and stared at that clean record, and you could see the wheels turning, because a smart man would have handed the license back and apologized and let it go. Daniel just stood there by his bike, patient, waiting, sipping the last of his coffee. Sarah Combs went back to filling her minivan, though her hand did not leave her phone, and in the back seat her 10-year-old, a boy named Cody, pressed his face to the glass and watched the whole thing with the wide, serious eyes of a child who is learning something about the world he will not have words for until he is much older. The farm truck men lost interest and drifted inside. Tyler went back behind the counter. Earl stood by his rig, pretending to check a tire, not going anywhere. The sun was warm. A dog trotted across the lot. For about 90 seconds, it looked like the whole thing was going to blow over, like it was going to be nothing but a bad memory and a story Daniel would tell some brother down the road with a shake of his head. It looked, for those 90 seconds, like everybody was going to get to go home. They were not going to get to go home. Kessler came back out of the cruiser, and he was holding the cuffs. That was the trigger. That was the moment the whole thing changed, and it changed into something none of the men in that town were prepared for. Because up to that second, this was a story about a bully and a grudge. One cop, one old man, one bad afternoon. What Kessler did next turned it into something with 100 moving parts, something with lawyers and cameras and a phone tree that reached across 4 states, something that would put his badge, his chief's pension, and the whole quiet little town on the front page. He was not picking a fight with one biker anymore. He was about to pull on a thread that was attached to something enormous, and he had absolutely no idea. "I ran your plate," Kessler said, and there was a nasty little grin on his face. "Turns out this bike's got a flag on it. Stolen vehicle report, couple counties over." That was a lie. There was no flag. There was no stolen report. He had invented it right there on the spot, because his ego could not stand the clean record and the calm eyes and the crowd that had watched him find nothing. He needed a reason, and when a man like Kessler needs a reason, he simply makes one. Turn around. Hands behind your back. You're being detained. Daniel turned around slowly. And here is where it gets important, so stay with me. He did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He put his hands behind his back, and as Kessler ratcheted the cuffs down too tight on purpose, Daniel said the only warning he would ever give. "Son," he said, "I have not done one thing wrong today. And you are about to make a phone call happen that you cannot unmake. So I am going to ask you one time, man to man. Let this go." He was not threatening him. Understand that. He was trying to save him. Daniel Cross, cuffs biting into his wrists, was trying to save the life of the man arresting him, because he already knew what was coming and Kessler did not. Kessler laughed in his face. He grabbed the back of Daniel's collar and shoved him toward the cruiser, and that was when it happened, the moment from the top of this story. He slammed the old man face first into the gas pump and kicked his boots apart and leaned in and said the ugly thing, the thing about where people like him belonged, and Daniel's cheek pressed against the cold metal and he said, quiet as anything, "You should not have done that." And the crowd had their phones up. And every second of it was recording. Now the phones matter more than you might think, so let me stay on that. 3 different people were filming by the time Kessler put Daniel on the pump. Sarah Combs, the nurse's aide, who was shaking with a fury she would feel in her hands for 2 days. Tyler, the kid from the counter, who had stepped back outside and lifted his phone without even deciding to. And Earl Prout, the truck driver, who had seen enough in 30 years on the road to know that this was the kind of thing that has to be caught, or it never happened at all. 3 angles. Clear audio. The "you people," the invented stolen bike lie, the shove, the ugly words, all of it, in high definition from 3 directions. That footage was going to matter. But it was not the footage that brought the storm. The footage came later. What came first was one phone call, and it was not to the media, and it was not to a lawyer, and it was not even to the police. Because here is what nobody in that parking lot knew. Daniel Cross was not just some road-worn old member passing through. Daniel Cross was one of the most respected men in the entire organization, in 4 states and beyond. He had held titles he never bragged about. He had settled disputes that would have turned into wars. He had walked into rooms where 2 chapters were one hard word away from bloodshed, and walked out an hour later with both sides shaking hands, because when Daniel Cross spoke, men who did not listen to anybody listened to him. There were chapters full of hard, dangerous men who would walk through fire for him, not because he demanded it, but because over 40 years he had earned it, one quiet act at a time. He had buried their fathers. He had found their sons' work. He had sat in more hospital hallways at 3 in the morning than any man should have to. When those men found out that someone had put their hands on Daniel Cross, an old man, unarmed, doing nothing, and called him garbage in a parking lot, there was not going to be a meeting about it. There was not going to be a discussion. There was going to be a ride. And the call went out because of the truck driver. Earl. Remember him. Earl finished filming and his hands were shaking and he did not know what to do, so he did what you do. He started asking around, half to himself, saying somebody's got to do something. And one of the farm truck men, an older fellow named Dale who had come back outside for a chew, happened to say, quiet, that his brother-in-law rode with a club 2 towns over and might know how to reach somebody. Dale made one call to his brother-in-law, a man named Pigpen who was elbow-deep in a carburetor at the time. Pigpen listened for about 15 seconds, wiped his hands, and made one more call to a man he called only by a road name, And that call reached exactly the right person. And within about 11 minutes, a message was moving across 4 states faster than any police radio. It did not say much. It said a location, and it said a name, and it said the words that light the fuse. One of ours. Down. Now. Think about how that works for a second, because it is the whole engine of this story. There is no headquarters. There is no button somebody pushes. There is just a web of men who have each other's numbers and a rule older than any of them. And when the name that went out was Daniel Cross, the web did not hesitate, not for one heartbeat. A man in a shop put down his tools. A man at a kitchen table pushed back his chair before his coffee was cold. A man 3 states away who was about to sit down to dinner with his family kissed his wife, said only, "I have to ride," and she did not ask why, because she had been married to it long enough to know that when he said it like that, the answer did not matter. 20 phone calls became 200. 200 became 1,000. And every one of them pointed at a Sunoco on Route 9, in a town most of them had never heard of. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is the part of this story people do not believe until they see it, and I want you here for all of it. Kessler, meanwhile, was having the time of his life. He had Daniel in the back of the cruiser now, and he was leaning against the hood, taking his time, filling out paperwork like a man who has all afternoon and nothing to fear. The crowd had thinned. He figured the show was over. He figured he had won. He called it in, told dispatch he had one in custody on a stolen vehicle and resisting. And dispatch, a woman named Carol who had known Kessler long enough to know exactly what he was, sighed and wrote it down, and figured it would be another one of his messes that quietly went away. Carol had a nephew Kessler had roughed up once. She wrote the call slow, and she did not hurry the backup, and if you want to know the truth, part of her hoped whatever was coming would come. She did not know how much was coming. Nobody did. It did not quietly go away. The first bike showed up about 20 minutes later. Just one. An older rider, gray in his beard, who rolled into the lot slow and easy, parked across from the cruiser, shut off his engine and just sat there. Watching. He did not say a word. He did not get off. He just looked at the cruiser and looked at Kessler and waited. Kessler noticed him and felt the first small cold drop of something down his spine, but he shook it off. One old biker. So what? He went back to his paperwork. Then there were 3. They came in from the state road, engines low, and parked in a neat line and shut down and waited. Then there were 7. Then there were 12, and now the sound of them was constant, that low rolling thunder coming from somewhere out past the edge of town, getting closer, not one direction but all of them. Kessler stood up straight. The pen was still in his hand. He looked at the 12 men sitting on their bikes, saying nothing, doing nothing, just watching him with that terrible patient stillness. And for the first time all day, Brett Kessler was not the biggest thing in the parking lot. He keyed his radio. His voice had gone up half an octave. "Dispatch, I'm gonna need some backup out here at the Sunoco on Route 9. Carol asked him what he had. Kessler looked around at the growing line of motorcycles and could not quite make himself say the number. "Just," he said. "Just send whoever's available. Situation's developing." situations developing. That is one way to put it. Here is another. In the time it took Carol to radio the other on-duty officers, the 12 had become 40. And out past the water tower, past the county line, on 3 different highways pointing straight at Halstead Junction, hundreds more were already rolling, and behind them hundreds more than that. It was not an army marching. It was something stranger and more frightening than that, if you were Kessler. It was quiet. It was orderly. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was tearing anything up. They were simply arriving, in numbers that did not stop, and taking up positions around a gas station, and waiting, with the awful calm of men who have all the time in the world and exactly one thing on their mind. And here is a detail I want you to hold on to, because it tells you everything about what kind of men these really were. As they arrived, they did not block the road. They left a lane open for regular traffic. They did not surround Sarah Combs' minivan, or crowd the farm truck, or frighten Tyler behind his counter. In fact, when Sarah finally got her boys buckled and started to pull out, shaking, not sure if she was even allowed to leave, one of the bikers, a huge man with a gray ponytail, stepped out and gently stopped traffic with one raised hand so she could pull onto the road safe, and he nodded to her like a man holding a door, and he said, "Drive careful, ma'am. Nothing here for you to worry about." Sarah told that part in every interview afterward, and it always got left out of the angry versions of the story, and it should not have been, because it was the truest part. These were not men who came to burn a town. These were men who came to stand. Daniel, in the back of the cruiser, saw them through the window, and he closed his eyes. He was not glad. Understand that. There was no triumph in him. He knew these men. He loved a lot of them. And he knew that a single wrong move, a single hothead, a single nervous cop with a shaky finger, could turn this quiet gathering into a bloodbath that would ruin lives on every side. So Daniel Cross, the man in the cuffs, the supposed criminal, became in that moment the most important peacekeeper in that entire county. He started banging his shoulder against the window to get Kessler's attention. Not to threaten him, to talk to him. Because the only man there who fully understood how bad this could get was the one Kessler had thrown in the back seat. Kessler ignored him at first, then finally cracked the window an inch, and Daniel said, low and urgent, "You need to listen to me now, son, because I am the only friend you have got left in this parking lot. Get on your radio and get your sheriff here, the real one, the county man, and do it before somebody outranks you who is scared. You do that and everybody goes home. You keep standing there posturing, and I cannot promise you what 1,000 grieving men do. Not because they want to. Because they are scared for me, same as your people are scared of them. Scared men and guns, boy. You know how that ends. Make the call." Kessler, pale now, made the call. The backup arrived first, such as it was. 2 more Halstead Junction cruisers, 4 officers total now counting Kessler, rolling up to find their colleague white as a sheet, and a gas station ringed by what was fast becoming an ocean of motorcycles. And one of those officers was Sergeant Ruiz. Remember him. Ruiz took one look at the scene and understood immediately that they were standing on the edge of a cliff. And worse than that, he understood that he had seen this coming for 2 years and had let it lie. He grabbed Kessler by the arm and pulled him behind a cruiser. "What did you do?" Ruiz said. It was not really a question. "Brett, look at me. What in God's name did you do?" He had a stolen bike. Kessler started, and Ruiz cut him off. "There's no stolen bike. There's no flag. I ran it myself on the way over. That man's got a cleaner record than you do." Ruiz looked out at the bikes. 60 now. 100. Coming down every road into town, and more behind them. "You cuffed the wrong man," Ruiz said very quietly. "You cuffed exactly the wrong man." And then Ruiz said something that cost him, something that a lot of men would not have had the spine to say out loud with their own department standing there. He said, "And I let this happen. I knew what you were and I let it lie, because the chief told me to, and I told myself that was good enough. Well, it wasn't. It was never gonna be enough. Look at it, Brett. That's 2 years of every complaint anybody ever swallowed, sitting on motorcycles, come to collect." And Kessler, who had spent his whole small life believing there were no consequences, finally felt the floor drop out from under him. Now the town itself was waking up to what was happening. You cannot move that many motorcycles into a place of 9,000 people without everyone knowing inside the hour. Shop owners came out onto the sidewalks. The high school, letting out, watched a river of chrome roll past the football field, and half the football team stood on the fence with their mouths open, because they had never in their lives seen anything so big come to their small town. The 3 churches, the diner, the hardware store, all of it emptied out onto Main Street to see the thunder. At the Bluebird, the old waitress who had poured coffee there for 40 years stood in the doorway with a pot still in her hand and said, to nobody, "Lord, Lord, what did that boy do now?" Because even she knew. Everyone knew, the second they heard, that if 1,000 bikers had come to Halsted Junction, it had something to do with Brett Kessler, because trouble in that town had a name and everyone had known it for years and said nothing. The mayor got a phone call. The county sheriff got a phone call. The state police got a phone call. And every single one of those calls said some version of the same impossible thing. There are hundreds of them. There are maybe 1,000. There are more coming. And they are all just sitting there, around the Sunoco, not doing anything, waiting. That waiting was the worst part for the police, and it was the most dangerous part, and it was entirely on purpose. Because the men on those bikes were not stupid. They knew the footage existed. They knew the whole world was about to be watching. They were not going to give Kessler and his kind the one thing that would let them turn Daniel into the villain. They were not going to throw a punch. They were not going to break a window. They were going to do something far more powerful than violence. They were going to stand there, in numbers no one could ignore, in total silence, and force the truth out into the open where everybody could see it. That is a kind of discipline most people never learn. It is a harder thing to stand still with 1,000 angry men than it is to swing. Every one of them knew it. And every one of them stood still, because a man they all trusted was in the back of that car, and they were not going to be the ones to get him hurt. The state police staged a mile out and did not come in, because the commander on the phone was smart enough to know that a wall of troopers in riot gear was exactly the spark that turns a peaceful stand into a catastrophe. He held his people back and waited for the county man, and thank God he did. Because the county man was Sheriff Tom Whitfield, and Tom Whitfield was about to do the bravest and smartest thing anyone in a uniform did all day. The county sheriff arrived within the hour. His name was Tom Whitfield, and he was everything Kessler was not. 30 years in law enforcement, close to retirement, a man who had spent his whole career trying to keep the peace in a hard county. And he knew, the second he pulled up and saw the sea of bikes, exactly what he was looking at. He had policed long enough to know the difference between a mob and a message, and this was a message. He did not swagger. He did not reach for his weapon. He told his own deputies to keep their hands off their belts and their mouths shut. He parked, and he got out slow with his hands visible, and he walked, alone, into the open space between the police cruisers and the front line of the motorcycles. And he did the smartest thing anyone in a uniform did all day. He asked to speak to whoever was in charge. A big man got off his bike. Not the biggest, but the one the others watched. He walked out to meet the sheriff, and the two of them stood there in the middle of that parking lot, one in a badge and one in leather, while 1,000 people held their breath. And the biker said something that Sheriff Whitfield would repeat, word for word, in every interview and every hearing that followed. He said, "We are not here to fight you, Sheriff. We are not here to fight anybody. There is an old man in the back of that car who never should have been touched. You are going to let him out. And then every single one of us is going to get on our bikes and leave, quiet as we came. That is the whole thing. That is all of it. Nobody has to get hurt today. But that man does not spend one more minute in those cuffs." Whitfield looked at him. He looked past him at the hundreds of faces, calm and hard and absolutely unified, at the road still pouring in more. He did the math that Kessler had been too small and too stupid to do. And then he asked one question, because he was an honest man and he wanted to hear the answer with his own ears. He said, "That man in the car. Who is he to you?" And the biker was quiet a moment, and then he said, "He's the man who sat up all night in a hospital with my boy when my boy came home from over there and did not want to be alive anymore. He talked him through till morning. My son is 30 now. Got 2 kids of his own. That's who's in your car, Sheriff. So you can see why we came." And Whitfield, 30 years on the job, a father himself, felt that one lands somewhere deep. He weighed the video he had not even seen yet against the clean record he already knew about, weighed one bad officer's ego against the safety of the whole town, and he made his choice. "Give me 5 minutes," Whitfield said. "And I give you my word, as sheriff of this county, that man walks out of here free." And the biker nodded once and stepped back, and the whole ocean of them settled in to wait for exactly 5 minutes, and not a second longer. What happened in those 5 minutes is the part that mattered most, and it happened not in the parking lot but behind a cruiser between 4 cops, out of the crowd's sight. Whitfield walked back to where Kessler, Ruiz, and the 2 other officers were standing, and he did not raise his voice, and that made it worse. "Uncuff him," Whitfield said. Kessler started to argue. He started in about the stolen bike, and resisting, and gang members, and Whitfield turned on him with 30 years of authority in his eyes and said, "Son, there is no stolen bike, and we both know it, And in about an hour, every phone in America is going to be playing a video of you slamming an unarmed veteran into a gas pump and calling him garbage. Now you can uncuff that man yourself and start the very long process of saving what is left of your career. Or I can do it for you, and you can go sit in my car. Those are your choices. Pick one. And Ruiz, standing there, said quietly, "Do it, Brett. For once in your life, do the small right thing." It was Ruiz saying it, the man who had stayed silent for 2 years, that seemed to break something loose in Kessler. Kessler's hands were shaking. Everything he had built his little kingdom on, the belief that he could do what he wanted, that there were no consequences, that the badge made him untouchable, all of it was collapsing at once. He walked to the cruiser. He opened the back door. He got Daniel out, and he uncuffed him, and the whole ocean of bikers watched in total silence as the cuffs came off the old man's wrists. And a strange thing happened in that silence. As the metal came away, a low sound rose up from the crowd. Not a cheer, nothing so cheap as a cheer, but a kind of long, released breath from 1,000 chests at once. The sound of an enormous held tension letting go. And then, quiet, that sound settled back into stillness, because it was not over yet and every one of them knew it. Daniel Cross stood up straight and rubbed the raw skin where the metal had bitten in, and he did not say a word to Kessler. He did not gloat. He did not even look at him. He looked out at the hundreds of men who had crossed 4 states in an afternoon for him, and something moved across his face that was very close to breaking, and he lifted one hand, just barely, to tell them it was all right. It was over. He was on his feet. Nobody needed to do anything. And here is the thing that separated Daniel Cross from every small man in this story, the thing that made him who he was. With the whole thing tipped in his favor, with an army at his back and a video that would end Kessler's career, with every right in the world to want blood, Daniel walked over to Sheriff Whitfield, and he shook his hand and he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, "You did the right thing today, Sheriff. You kept your town safe. I will make sure everyone knows that." He was already, in that moment, diffusing it. He was already making sure that the story would be about one bad cop and not about a whole town, about one man's cruelty and not about a war in a parking lot. Even bleeding at the wrists, Daniel Cross was still the most responsible man there. And then he did one more thing that nobody expected. He turned to Sergeant Ruiz, who was standing off to the side with his jaw tight, and he looked at him a long moment and he said, "You tried, didn't you? Before today. You tried and they wouldn't hear you." And Ruiz, startled, just nodded. And Daniel said, "Keep trying. After today, they'll hear you. That's on you now." And Ruiz would carry those words the rest of his career. Then Daniel turned to face the bikes. And he raised his voice, the voice that men leaned in to hear, and he said the words that ended it. "We got what we came for." He's standing up. "Now we ride out the way we came in. Slow. Legal. No trouble. Let the cameras show them exactly who we are." And they did. One by one, then in rows, then in a river, the engines came to life, and the ocean of motorcycles began to move, and it flowed out of Halstead Junction as orderly and peaceful as a funeral procession. Hundreds of them, then 1,000, out past the water tower and the high school and the 3 churches, back onto the highways, back toward home, without breaking a single window or throwing a single punch or giving Brett Kessler one shred of the excuse he so badly needed. Along Main Street, people had come out to watch them go, and the strangest thing happened. Somebody started to clap. Then somebody else. And by the time the last rows rolled through, half the town was standing on the sidewalks applauding the men they had been raised to be afraid of, because they had all just watched 1,000 outlaws come to their town for justice and leave without so much as a raised voice. And something in that told the plain truth better than any speech ever could. They had come to make a point, and the point was made, and it was made without spilling a drop of blood, and that was the most powerful thing of all. Daniel got back on his old black touring bike. He started it up. And he rode out last of all, alone, the way he had come in, an old man on a long road home. But he did not leave without one final act. He rode slow past Sheriff Whitfield, and he nodded to him, one man to another. And he rode slow past Brett Kessler, who was standing by the cruiser looking like a man watching his whole life burn down, and Daniel stopped. He looked at him for a long moment, and he did not say anything cruel. He said, "I tried to tell you, son. I wasn't threatening you. I was trying to save you." And then he rode away, and left Brett Kessler standing in the ruins of the kingdom he thought would never fall. Now you might think that is the end. It is not the end. Because what happened after the bikes rode out was, in its own way, even bigger than the day itself. The 3 videos hit the internet by that evening, and they did what those things do. Sarah Combs was the first to post hers from her kitchen table, with her hand still not quite steady, and she wrote under it only 4 words, "This happened here today." Millions of views by morning. Tens of millions by the end of the week. Tyler's angle and Earl's angle went up right behind it, and between the 3 of them there was no gap, no missing second, no way for anyone to claim it was taken out of context, because you could watch the whole thing from 3 directions, and it said the same thing every time. The whole country watched a 66-year-old black veteran, a man who had done everything right, get lied about and manhandled and called garbage by a cop drunk on his own power. And the whole country got angry, the good kind of angry, the kind that actually changes things. The 3 complaints that had disappeared into a drawer came back out of the drawer. Reporters found the people who had filed them, and those people talked, and it turned out Brett Kessler had a long, ugly pattern that a whole department had been quietly covering for. And here is where Ruiz kept the promise Daniel had handed him. When the state investigators came, Sergeant Marcus Ruiz did not protect the department, and he did not protect himself. He sat down across a table from them and he told them everything, the complaints he had carried to the chief, the times he had been told to let it lie, his own 2 years of silence and what it had cost. It was not easy for him. A man does not enjoy standing up and saying, "I saw it, and for too long I said nothing." But he said it on the record with his name attached, and it broke the whole thing open. The chief, who was 2 years from his pension, did not make it 2 more weeks. He retired under a cloud, and the state opened an investigation into how a man like Kessler had been allowed to operate for so long with so many warnings ignored. Because that is the truth this story is really about, if you strip everything else away. It was never just one bad cop. It was a system that let the bad cop believe he would never pay for it. It was every complaint that got swallowed, every good officer told to let it lie, every drawer deep enough to hide a thing that everyone in town already knew. And it took an old man on a motorcycle and 1,000 of his brothers to finally drag that system out into the daylight. Brett Kessler was fired. Not quietly, not with a handshake and a pension, but fired on camera, his name in every headline in the state. The invented stolen vehicle report became its own criminal matter, because it turns out that filing a false report to justify an arrest is a serious thing, and this time there was no drawer deep enough to hide it in. He faced charges. He lost the badge that had been the only thing that ever made him feel big. And the last anybody heard, he had left Halstead Junction entirely, because a man cannot stay in a town where everyone has watched the exact moment he became the most hated person in the county. The kingdom was gone, and he had built its destruction with his own 2 hands in about 10 minutes at a gas station in front of 3 cameras. But I do not want to leave you on Kessler, because Kessler is not the point. The point is Daniel Cross. In the weeks that followed, when the reporters found him, when the cameras came looking for the veteran from the video, Daniel did the same thing he had always done. He kept it simple, and he kept it quiet, and he made it about something bigger than himself. He did not sue the town, though every lawyer in 3 states offered, and some of them offered numbers that would have set him up for the rest of his life. He turned them all down. He said the town was not the man, and he would not punish 9,000 people for what one of them did. He did not go on the talk shows. He gave exactly 1 interview, sitting in his garage with grease on his hands, and when they asked him if he had been afraid that day, he shook his head. When they asked him if he had wanted revenge, he shook his head again. And when they asked him why 1,000 men had ridden across 4 states for him, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the only thing that ever really explained it. Because a long time ago, Daniel said, when I had nothing, and the whole world had already decided what a man like me was worth, a group of men looked at me and saw a brother. And they made me a promise that they would never leave me on the ground. Every day since, I have tried to be the kind of man who keeps that same promise for somebody else. That is all Apache ever really was. It was never about being feared. It was about not being alone. He looked into the camera then, this old man with the silver beard and the scarred hands, and he said, that cop thought he was arresting a criminal. He wasn't. He was arresting a man who was never, not for 1 single day of his life, going to be left standing alone. And he found that out the hard way. The town of Halstead Junction changed after that. Sheriff Whitfield, the man who walked out alone with his hands visible and chose peace over pride, got most of the credit he deserved, and he finished his career with his head high, and when he retired the next spring, half the town came out to shake his hand. The department got cleaned out and rebuilt, and the man they made chief to rebuild it was Marcus Ruiz, because a town that has just learned what silence costs knows the value of a man who finally found his voice. Sarah Combs' boy, Cody, the 10-year-old who had watched the whole thing through the window of a minivan, wrote about it 2 years later for a school assignment, about the day he learned that doing the right thing and being the loudest thing in the room are not the same, and his teacher cried reading it. And every year after that, on the anniversary, a small group of writers would come back through town, quiet and legal, and stop at the Sunoco on Route 9, and buy coffee from the kid behind the counter, who was not a kid anymore, who was a grown man now with a family of his own, but who still worked a shift there sometimes just so he could be there on that day. And they would stand for a minute in the spot where it happened. Not to celebrate, to remember, to remind anyone who was watching that some promises do not have an expiration date. And Daniel Cross kept riding, the way he always had, an old man on a long road, quiet and calm, doing small good things that nobody ever saw. He is out there still, as far as I know. Somewhere on some empty highway, letting the road do what the road does. And if you ever pull into a gas station and see a big man with a silver beard filling up an old black touring bike, and you feel like giving him a hard time because of the patch on his back or the color of his skin, or any other small reason a small mind can invent, I would think about this story first. I would think real hard. Because you never know who is standing quiet in front of you. You never know what 40 years of loyalty is folded up inside that calm. And you never, ever know how many people are one phone call away from riding all night, just to make sure that man is not left standing alone. That is where we started, at a gas pump, with an old man in cuffs and a cop who thought he had all the power in the world. And that is where we end, with the cuffs off, and the cop gone, and the old man riding free down an open road, exactly the way he came in. Take care of each other out there. And remember, nobody is ever really as alone